Daniel chapter 1. Well, we read in verse 1, it's the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, and Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. The year is actually 605. We've talked about these three deportations to Babylon. Here's the first in 605, and it's the first verse of Daniel. Verse 4, what happens during this siege? Young men in whom there was no blemish were taken. They were good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge, and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. So taken from Jerusalem are many men, apparently. Daniel is among them. And we hear the story and stories to come in the book of Daniel of three other men as well that are called out, but probably hundreds, possibly, who are taken off to Babylon to learn what's called the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Now, that would originally be Akkadian, and then in time turn into Aramaic. And so that's what the language change would be from a Proto-Hebrew, early Hebrew script to some kind of an Aramaic script as we go in the story. So this is some kind of, I would call it kind of an attempt at a brain drain on Israel. What is Nebuchadnezzar doing is taking the wise from Israel, so to leave in its place just the weak and the poor and so forth. Well, verse 8, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. Therefore he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. We're not sure exactly why Daniel did not want to eat the king's meat. It could just be kosher. More likely, it's the fact that this meat or this food that would have been placed before these wise men was probably dedicated to the gods of Babylon. And so Daniel and others refused. By showing loyalty to Yahweh, they are going to refuse to eat food that has been dedicated to the gods of Babylon. Starting in verse 11, so Daniel said to the steward, now he is putting the steward in a precarious situation because he refuses to eat the meat that has been dedicated to the god of Babylon, Bel, and now what is he going to do? I think it's an interesting story. So Daniel says to the steward, please test your servants for 10 days. Let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, then let our appearance be examined before you. So he just makes a basic deal with the eunuch, and we don't know by what understanding Daniel had that this bet would work. But we're just following the story as we hear it, and that is that he's trusting his God, Daniel and these other boys, that if they trust Yahweh and not eat the meat sacrificed to Bel, that they would actually be better off. And so as this story goes on to the end of the chapter, as for these four young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. That idea of visions and dreams, which we saw in the book of Joel, is a way of, just a simple, quick way of defining someone who's in contact with Yahweh, or Yahweh is wanting to be working through that person in their ability to understand dreams and visions. Well, verse 20, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in the realm. So chapter 1 ends a very brief, powerful but quick story of Daniel and these three other men who refused to worship Bel and worshiped Yahweh instead, and God rewarded them with becoming better in appearance and in wisdom than the other men. So in summary, how does the book of Daniel begin? What is the book of Daniel about? We could say it that way. First of all, Daniel will have a long and powerful ministry. It's going to go from 605 all the way through, well, this will be the Babylonian exile. This will go all the way to Persia, the idea that Persia will someday destroy Babylon. That will be 539 In fact, the last verse of chapter 1, we hear that Daniel in his ministry goes all the way to the first year of Persia at least, and that's 69 years. So Daniel would be taken as probably a young teenager and have a 70-year or so ministry. So he'll be an old man by the time our story is done. He and these other boys that we read about in chapter 1 will be examples of fully integrated Jews or Hebrews living in a fully pagan land. Remember that what makes Babylon will be the worship of Bel, their divine patron. And so Daniel, many of these stories will be coming up in the book of Daniel, will be how a Yahweh loyalist can stay loyal to his God even though he's living in a land that is loyal to another deity. That will be basically the story of the book of Daniel. As we read, Daniel will be learning the language of Aramaic. Chapters 2 through 7 of Daniel are written in Aramaic originally. And so the book of Daniel seems to have been penned. This just fits the story very well. The book of Daniel, those middle chapters 2 through 7, will be penned in the land of Babylon, written in their language. This will be a time, number 3 on my list, a development of how to apply Torah to a new situation. Remember, they're coming out of Israel, where Torah was instrumental in how to live. They're going to be taking it into a land where they don't have the same ability to live out the life of Torah, for example, with priests and a temple and so forth. So that's why we're going to hear of the development of ideas like the synagogue and rabbis and exchanging almsgiving for sacrifice. These will all be ideas that really start while in Babylon, and they'll push their way all the way into the New Testament era. One more thing, I would say the grand theme of Daniel, if we have one, is the concept of what we'll call borrowed authority. Remember in our story how God has delegated authority to the gods of the nations, delegated in the sense that when it comes to who has ultimate role or reign over the world, it will be Yahweh. But he often will designate power to other beings that these nations will worship, so they have actual power. The stories that we'll see will be always comparing, well, even though we have a nation that is worshiping this God and a king, a very powerful king, Nebuchadnezzar, for example, who does Nebuchadnezzar in the end need to acknowledge? It will be the God that has created all things. So I like to consider the book of Daniel a story or stories of what it is to, what it means to live as a Babylonian under borrowed authority. And then as we consider how Daniel will play this out, we will notice, again, here he is one of very few people in our biblical stories where a personal sin or behavioral wickedness is never recorded of this person. But again, don't be thrown off course by that. The story is not about a person who has behavioral perfection. That's not the point at all. What we will see time and time again in the story of Daniel, and I'll point this out as we go through, and you'll be able to see it as you read it for yourself, that the story is about loyalty. Again, how an individual who is living in a land of non-loyalists can be very loyal to his Creator God, and in fact, without fail, choose Yahweh at every turn.